It's the old one. It's the old one. Okay. Well, I asked Bruno to bring me a glass of water. I think he's got it. Oh, it's okay. So, good evening, everyone. You're all sitting so far away. I don't have a contagious disease. No, it's okay. You can sit wherever you like. It's fine. Can you hear me okay? Is it okay, the sound? Yes? Is it okay? Can you hear me? Okay. So, good evening, and thank you for coming. And I'm happy to be here again. I think it's been quite a few years since I was last here in Jamyang. So it's nice to have the chance to come back. So what I'll do is I'll talk for a while, and then we'll do some meditation, and then we'll have some free time for questions if anyone would like to ask a question. I'll do my best to answer. So I was asked to talk about this book that I wrote. So I thought to tell a little bit of the story behind it. Because I never really had the plan to write a book. It's kind of an accidental book. And also, at the time when I wrote the book, I was living here in England, up in the north, in Manjushri Institute in Cumbria. And I lived there for 3 years, from 1979 to 1982. At that time it was an FPMT Center. It was connected with this center here and this worldwide organization. And the reason I went there, I had already been a nun for a number of years, and I really wanted to study more. I wanted to study Buddhist philosophy. And they were just starting a program in Buddhist philosophy. So that was my reason for going there. So I did this study program. And I didn't have much money. I was very poor. So to be able to stay there, I worked part-time for Wisdom Publications, this publishing company that started there. And now it's in Boston, and it's quite a big company. They have published many, many books. So I worked part-time for Wisdom Publications doing editing work, and the rest of my time I studied and did my practices and so forth. So while I was doing editing work for Wisdom Publications, Venerable Rabina, some of you might have met her, Rabina Corton. She's also been here a number of times to teach. So she was the main, I guess you could call, editor-in-chief. Maybe that was her title, I don't remember. Because she comes from a family that in Australia, the family ran a publishing business. So she had a lot of experience with producing publications. So she was kind of, one of the leading persons. And she had this idea to make a book of the sort of meditations and practices that we normally do in our organization, the Foundation for the Preservation of the Mahayana Tradition, which started out in Nepal and then gradually spread all over the world. So there's certain prayers, practices, meditations that we usually do in this organization. And she thought it would be a really good idea to put them all together in a book. Back in those days, there weren't many books of Buddhist practices and Buddhist meditation. They were very hard to come by. Now there's thousands of books. You don't have time to read all of them. So I started working on that. And it was just going to be a little book, a little publication that we would use in our centers. But then at some point she said, why don't we make a proper book about meditation that could go into bookshops? Because there isn't much available about meditation, and there's a lot of people who want to learn it. So the book then became a much bigger project, and a real book, not just like a little booklet or a little pamphlet, an internal publication. So the book kind of went through various changes along the way. Rabina would, tell me, do this, do that, and I would just write it, and then I'd send it back to her, and then she'd chop it all up, and then, I'd have to redo it. And in those days, we didn't have computers, so every time we made changes to the book, it had to be retyped. You remember those days? Maybe some of you. Oh my God, how much time I spent on this clunky old typewriter retyping this book. Computers are great. So, so anyway, that's the origin of the book. And then it was published in 1984. And I didn't really expect that it would be popular. I was really surprised that it became kind of a Buddhist bestseller, I guess you could call it. Not like an international bestseller, but it's been very popular, and it's still being sold. It's still selling after 40, how many years now? 35, 36, 37 years. It's still quite popular, and I get people thanking me, writing to me, or just meeting me and saying, "Oh, thank you so much for that book. It's been so helpful." So I'm happy that I had the chance to do this. And like I say, it wasn't really my idea or my intention to write a book. It was more like I was asked to do it, and then it just sort of, happened. But I'm happy that I was able to do this work and that it has been beneficial to people. But I really don't feel comfortable taking credit, because whatever is in the book are things that I've learned from my own teachers. And I feel extremely fortunate that I did have the chance to meet so many wonderful teachers. I first went to India in 1973 and stayed in Dharamsala for a number of months, studying at the Tibetan library with Geshe Ngawang Dargye, who was the first teacher there. And then I met Lama Yeshe, Lama Zopa, Serkun Rinpoche, Song Rinpoche, many lamas, both at that time in India and then later over the years. So many of these lamas have passed away now, and including Lama Yeshe, the founder of our organization. And I still meet people who say, even though he's, it's been more than 30 years that he passed away, people say, "Oh, I really wish that I had met him. I really feel like he's my teacher," from reading his books or watching videos, some videos on YouTube and so on. So they feel this connection with Lama Yeshe, even though they didn't have the chance to meet him. So then it really makes me feel how fortunate I am that I was able to meet these wonderful, amazing teachers who had such incredible qualities, wisdom and knowledge, but also so much compassion and love, humility, patience. And for me, I was attracted to Buddhist ideas right from the beginning, I found the ideas of Buddhism really wonderful, really interesting, really fascinating. But I was also so attracted to the people. That's one of the things that really got me kind of hooked into Buddhism, was just to see the result of these ideas and these practices. To see that through learning about these ideas, practicing them, living them in their life, then this is the result. These wonderful, wonderful qualities. I mean, of course, there's still many wonderful teachers in the world today, so everyone does have the chance to meet them. Of course, His Holiness the Dalai Lama is still with us, thank goodness. Lama Zopa Rinpoche, Geshe Tashi here in London. So I hope you have some understanding of what I'm saying when I say that it's quite amazing to meet teachers who embody the practices, the principles, the ideas of Buddhism. So I had the chance to meet many teachers, learn from them, and so whatever is in this book really comes from them. And the book is somewhat complicated in a way because it contains many, many different kinds of practices. And I wonder sometimes when people are just beginning to learn about Buddhism, how they manage. I suppose they can pick and choose and just, do those meditations that they feel comfortable with. But on the other hand, it does give a sense of the great variety of different practices, different kinds of practices and meditations within Buddhism. So my teachers, the Tibetan lamas that I've studied with, often say that there's many, many different kinds of meditation practices, but all of them can be divided into two types of meditation. And one, they have somewhat technical terms, but I'll explain them to hopefully make them more clear. So one type of meditation practice they call placement meditation or stabilizing meditation. A more common term would be concentration meditation, because it's for the purpose of training our mind in concentration, meaning being able to stay on one object for longer and longer periods of time. I mean, initially, when we first try to practice meditation, have all of you done meditation before, or is there anyone who hasn't ever done meditation? Yeah, so you all have some experience. So you know what I'm talking about when I say that it's very difficult to keep the mind on your object for more than a very short time, maybe a few seconds, a few counts of breaths. And actually, this is quite normal. I just read the other day, a study was done by Microsoft Corporation in 2015, and they found that human beings normally are able to stay focused on one object for 8 seconds. And they say that's even worse than goldfish. Goldfish are considered, pretty scattered, but they can stay focused for 9 seconds. So it means human beings have kind of gotten worse than goldfish. And it is worse also than in the past, because they say back, I think in 2000, a study showed that human beings could stay focused for 12 seconds. So it means in just 5 years, it's gone from 12 to 8, which is a pretty big jump. And that 2000 is the start of the mobile revolution. That's when people started having mobile phones. So maybe there's some connection there. Maybe. Anyway, so if you do find it difficult to keep your mind focused on your object, like a typical object used in meditation is the breath, right? I mean, there's other objects you can use, but the breath is a very common object. And it's also relatively easy because it's already there. We're breathing all the time anyway. So we don't have to think of anything or visualize anything or invent anything. We just focus on something that's already there, already present every moment. And also I think focusing on the breath has the effect of calming us down. Naturally, physiologically, it makes us feel calmer when we pay attention to our breathing. So it's a good object to start with. And yet, even after, not just at the beginning, but even after months or years of practice, people still find it's very, very hard to stay on the breath for more than a short time. The mind wanders away, gets distracted, and then we have to bring it back. And then again it wanders away, and we have to bring it back, and so on and so forth. But if one persists in this practice and puts time, effort, energy into the practice, it's training. We're training our mind to be able to stay focused on an object. And the result of that is we will find it possible to stay for longer and longer periods of time on the breath, especially if you have a chance to be in retreat. I mean, if you're in a normal mode of living in a city, for example, having a job, having a family to take care of, and so on and so forth, so your life is quite busy, you have many things to do, and you're practicing maybe 15, 20 or more minutes each day, but the rest of the time, I mean, that's only 15 minutes out of, many hours of being very busy. So then when you do try to meditate, you'll probably find that you're thinking about the shopping list or, things you have to do at work, phone call you have to make. So it's very difficult, very challenging to try to keep your mind focused because there's so many other things to think about. But if you have the chance to go off and do a retreat, have any of you done that? Have you ever had the chance to do a retreat? Yeah. So in a retreat situation, you're usually away from home, you're in a quiet place, you don't have to do other things, maybe the food is cooked for you, so all you have to do is come to the meditation hall and sit and do meditation. And if the retreat lasts for more than a few days, you will probably find that as the days go by, you become more and more calm, and your ability to stay focused on your object will get a little bit longer. Have you had that experience? Yeah. So that shows that if we put more time, more energy, more effort into training our mind in staying focused, staying concentrated, then it does become easier. It is something that can be developed. And Buddhism, and not only Buddhism, but also in Hinduism, it's said that it's possible, if you really put time and energy into this practice, you can reach the point, this is what we call shamatha, or calm abiding, the point where you are able to stay focused, concentrated on your chosen object, the breath or whatever it is, for hours without being distracted or sleepy or bored or tired. And so your mind is very clear, very fresh, very concentrated, and blissful. They say, in your body and your mind, you'll feel blissful. So that's a very high degree of concentration, but it is possible. People are able to do it. So that's the first kind of meditation. Placement or concentration meditation. And it is for the purpose of training our mind to stay concentrated, to stay focused. And then the second kind of meditation, general type of meditation, is called Analytical Meditation. And it doesn't seem that this kind of meditation is done in all Buddhist traditions, but it is found in at least all the Tibetan Buddhist traditions. I'm not sure about other, Japanese or Korean or whatever. Analytical meditation is different than placement meditation because we use thought. We could also call it contemplation. We think about, or we contemplate, or we reflect on certain topics that are part of the Buddha's teachings. It's not that you just let your mind go everywhere and think about anything and everything, but you have a certain topic that you are contemplating. For example, the very first teaching that the Buddha gave is on the Four Noble Truths. So we probably, we've heard these, read these many, many times. We can recite them off from memory. But that's not enough. It's not enough just to know what the Four Truths are and be able to talk about them. The real point is to have a deep understanding of the Four Noble Truths, to really make them part of our life, part of our experience, integrate them into our experience. And the means for doing that is analytical meditation, meaning, let's say, just say the first noble truth, the truth of suffering or true suffering. So you would sit down and focus your mind. First, it's always good to calm your mind down. Do the meditation on the breath for a while to calm down. And then contemplate this first noble truth, the truth of suffering, thinking about different kinds of suffering. And the Buddha himself and other Buddhist masters have given lists of different kinds of sufferings that exist. So we go through these lists, we contemplate them, we try to see examples of them in our own experience and also in the experience of other people around us and so on. So the purpose of this is to really deeply understand the reality of suffering, how much painful, difficult, unsatisfying experiences there are in our life and in the lives of everybody else, all beings who are not yet enlightened, who have not yet reached nirvana. And this may sound really depressing. Oh, meditate on suffering? Why would I want to do that? People sometimes have the idea that when we meditate, we should meditate on things that are beautiful and pleasant and sweet and uplifting. But the purpose, this is the very first thing that the Buddha taught after he attained enlightenment. And the reason is because there is suffering. We do have suffering. Everybody has suffering. And our normal tendency is to not want to look at it. We want to look the other way. We don't really want to deal with it, face it, accept it. We're often trying to avoid it, trying to run away, trying to escape from it. But in fact, that doesn't work. We can't escape from suffering. It's part of us. It's our body, our mind, They're in the nature of suffering. They're in the nature of dissatisfaction, unsatisfactoriness. And the reason it's important to accept that is so that then we have the energy to do something about it, to do what needs to be done to get ourselves out of suffering. Because Buddha didn't only teach suffering, but he went on to talk about why we suffer, where does our suffering come from, and then it's possible to get rid of it, to stop suffering. And there's a way to do that, the path. The fourth truth is the path. So the whole purpose of looking at suffering, being aware of suffering, seeing it very, very deeply, very clearly, is so that we will feel energized, enthusiastic, inspired to work on the methods for eliminating suffering, for overcoming suffering, for being free of suffering. And if we do that ourselves, we free ourselves from suffering, then we're in a position where we can help others to do the same. So that's why it's useful to meditate on suffering. It's not so that we become depressed and miserable and feel despair, but it's so we get energized to do something about it for ourselves and for others. So the point I'm trying to make is that it's not enough just to know words like, oh, there's true suffering, and there's this kind of suffering and that kind of suffering, but we want to contemplate these ideas, make our understanding of them deeper and deeper and deeper so that they change our mind and change our life in a more positive way. So that's the general purpose of doing analytical meditation. And also, we could say that these two types of meditation, placement meditation and analytical meditation, are for the purpose of developing two very important aspects of the path. One is concentration, because we have to be able to concentrate our mind. If our mind is scattered and all over the place, out of control, we can't control it, then we're going to have a lot of problems, for one thing, but also being able to make progress on the spiritual path, bring about the transformation of our mind. It's not going to be effective. It's not going to work. So they say concentration is like a tool, a very important, very essential tool with which we can then use our mind to do whatever we want. But concentration alone isn't enough. That's not an end in itself. It's more like a means to an end. And that's why the other kind of meditation, the analytical meditation, is important, because that is to develop wisdom. Wisdom means understanding the true nature of things, understanding how things are. And this is really important. In fact, it's probably the most important thing. Because the Buddha, what he discovered in his practice, his path, he discovered that all the different kinds of suffering and problems, difficulties that we have and that we find in the world around us, they all can be traced to one main cause or source, and that is ignorance. Ignorance of the true nature of things. Ignorance doesn't mean simply not knowing, or, like we say, someone who hasn't gone to school is illiterate, they don't know how to read, and so on. So it's not like that. A person can be highly educated, have a PhD or 2 or 3 PhDs, but still have ignorance. In Buddhism, when we talk about ignorance, it's a kind of delusion or confusion about the way things exist. And it permeates our mind, it permeates our experiences, such that everything we see, hear, smell, taste, touch, think, every experience we have with our mind is kind of veiled by this factor of ignorance, in the sense that we just don't see things as they are. It starts with our own self, our own sense of I, me, who I am, what I am. We think we know ourselves, probably, most people. We have confidence, I am like this, I'm like that, and we have a strong sense of an I, of a self, and we're probably quite confident that we know ourselves as we are, and that we exist the way we think we do. Buddhism asks us to question that. Is that true? Do you really know yourself as you are? There's a wonderful book that came out a few years ago. It's teachings by the Dalai Lama, but edited by Jeffrey Hopkins. It's called How to See Yourself as You Really Are. It's a nice little book about this topic of emptiness, or selflessness, as it's called. So this is a big question Buddha asks us to look at. Do you really see yourself as you really are? Do you have a correct understanding of your own self, your own sense of I, me, whatever our name is? And according to the Buddha, what he discovered, because he was once like us, he wasn't always a Buddha. He was once an ordinary, confused, unhappy, suffering person like ourselves. But he spent a number of years sitting in the forest, looking at his mind, looking at his experiences, and came to see that, the mind is confused. The mind sees things in a mistaken way. And that's the source of our suffering. That's what we need to clear up, to clear away, to be free of suffering. So he experienced that. He reached a state of complete freedom from suffering, and he did so by changing the way of seeing things, his sense of self, his sense of others, his sense of the world, and everything. So he asks us to do the same, to look at the way we see things and check if we're seeing things correctly or not. Starting with I, our own self, others, other people, the things we see around us in the world. Do we see things correctly or not? Do we see things as they are or not? So the Buddhist view, but this is something we have to check for ourselves, of course. The Buddhist view is no, we don't. We see things mistakenly. And that's how we get ourselves into trouble. That's how we have all the problems that we have. So the antidote to this problem of ignorance is wisdom. Wisdom and ignorance are like opposite. Ignorance is like a problem, something painful, something problematic, like a disease of the mind. And then wisdom is like the antidote, the remedy, the medicine that clears up this disease, this problem. And when we're able to clear up this disease of ignorance, then we experience incredible peace and happiness, enlightenment. No more suffering, no more delusions, no more anger, hatred, greed, jealousy, pride. So all the other disturbing emotions as well are cleared away because they're all based on ignorance. So anyway, there's these two very important factors of concentration on one hand and wisdom on the other. Both of those need to be developed in order to transform our mind and bring our mind out of suffering, bring our mind to enlightenment. So placement meditation is for developing concentration, and then analytical meditation, the ultimate purpose of that is to develop wisdom. So that's why the Tibetan Lamas say we need both types of meditation. If we're only doing concentration meditation, you can get very good concentration, you can feel incredible bliss, physical and mental bliss, but that alone isn't enough to clear up our problem, to overcome ignorance. Just with concentration alone, ignorance will not be cleared away. It will still be there. Maybe it will be very much subdued, not sort of jumping all over the place, making our mind crazy, but it's still there in the mind. So that's why it's necessary to develop wisdom, and the way to develop wisdom is by means of analytical meditation. The Sanskrit terms for these, you might have heard, shamatha is the method for developing concentration, and then vipassana, which is sometimes translated as special insight, is the meditation, the kind of practice for developing wisdom. So I hope this isn't scaring you away. If you're relatively new to meditation, it may sound like, wow, so much. But I'm talking about this because in this book contains both explanations of both types of meditation, placement and analytical meditations. And probably for many of us who are born in the West, grown up in the West, I know for myself, I really liked learning about analytical meditation, partly because I have a very busy mind. I like to think. I like to analyze, to question. So for me, doing that kind of meditation was really, really interesting. Because analytical meditation is also used to make changes in our mind. So we can use it to, like for example, if you're having problems with somebody, you're having a conflict in a relationship with somebody else, you're feeling angry or resentful or jealous or whatever. So your mind is kind of agitated with these kind of emotions, which are very painful, very disturbing. So you can use analytical meditation to look at your mind, look at your thoughts, what's going on, and hopefully you'll see some mistakes that you're making, and then you can change that. You can change your way of thinking. So it's a bit like this type of therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, I think is, yeah. So I don't know much about psychology or therapy, but I've heard people who know about this type of therapy say it's very similar to analytical meditation. You're working with your thoughts, working with your concepts, your assumptions, your habitual tendencies, and so forth, and bringing about changes in them. So it's very practical. It's very, very useful, very practical in our daily life. Because often, stuff is coming up in our mind, and it can be swirling around in our mind, and we can feel really unhappy, depressed, confused, irritated, whatever, in a bad mood. So it can be very helpful to sit down and look at the mind, what's going on. And there's different kinds of meditations for working with different kinds of problems. For example, anger, or attachment, or jealousy, or depression. There's actually a section in this book for that, how to work with disturbing emotions. So analytical meditation can be useful for that. So it's very helpful, on a daily basis with disturbing emotions that you have. But the other type of meditation is also very helpful. What was that? Because we also need to learn how to calm down our mind. Like I was saying, our lives tend to be very busy, very hectic, very crazy, and it's very important to have a time every day, if possible, to just sit quietly and try to let your mind settle down, let all your thoughts and whatever, emotions, memories, and so on, let all of that busyness settle down. So it's good for us mentally, it's also good for us physically, to have that kind of practice. So maybe I've talked enough, and maybe it would be nice to do some meditation. I don't want to spend all the time talking. So let's do some practice, and then if you have any questions afterwards, I will try to answer them. So get yourself into a comfortable position. Whether you're sitting on the floor or you're sitting on a chair, find a position that isn't too painful, that is as comfortable as possible. But it's also good if you can keep your back straight, because that will help your mind to be more clear, awake, alert, and focused. So unless you have some back problem that would prevent you from sitting up straight, then try to sit up straight. But that doesn't mean being tense. So at the same time, try to let your shoulders be relaxed. You can have your hands resting on your lap or on your knees, whichever you're more comfortable with. Let your arms be relaxed by your sides. And another way to get more relaxed at the beginning of a meditation session is to take a few deep breaths. So breathe in slowly and deeply, as much as you can before it becomes uncomfortable. Pause for a moment and then let the breath go out. You can let it go out through your mouth if you like, or through your nose. But let it go out slowly, not in a rush. Let the exhalation of the air go out, and you can imagine if there's any tension in your body or in your mind, it goes out with the breath and disappears in space. So do that for 3 breaths. Breathing in deeply, breathing out slowly through your mouth or your nose. And then after that, go back to your normal rate of breathing. So do your best to breathe in a natural way and avoid controlling your breath, manipulating your breath, regulating your breath. There's no need to do that because our body knows how to breathe on its own. It's breathing all day, 24 hours a day, even when we're asleep. So there's no need at all to control your breath. So just let go of that, let go of controlling, and just allow the body to breathe in a natural way. Sometimes the breath might be longer or deeper, sometimes shorter, shallower. That's okay. The rhythm of the breath doesn't have to be exactly the same every time. Again, your body knows how much air it needs to take in. So just allow the breath to be natural. And then with your mind, your awareness, in a light way, not in a heavy way, lightly be aware of the rhythm of the breathing, coming in, going out. And you can do that in whatever way you like. Some people watch the air at the nostrils. You might feel the slight sensation of the breath coming in and going out of the nostrils. Other people watch at the abdomen, which is moving in and out with each breath. So those are the 2 places that are often recommended. But you could also find your own way of being aware of the breath. It doesn't matter so much where or how, but the point is to just stay with the breath. Try to keep your mind aware of each full inhalation of the breath and the exhalation of the breath. Doing this for one breath after another. So watching the breath is a bit like an anchor for the mind, keeping the mind anchored in the present, the here and now. Just like an anchor keeps a ship in one place so that it doesn't float away. But of course, the mind by nature doesn't stay focused on one thing for very long, for more than a few seconds. So naturally, other thoughts will come up, or we will hear sounds and be distracted by those, or other feelings in our body. So all kinds of things can happen while we're sitting here trying to watch the breath. So don't be surprised or upset if these happen. It's natural, it's normal. And also don't be surprised if your mind gets distracted away from the breath to these other things, thoughts, memories, sounds, and so forth. That's normal, that's natural. So try to stay calm and patient with yourself and just try to notice whenever your mind goes away from the breath to any other object. And when you have become aware of that, just disengage your mind from that other object. Let it go, put it aside, come back to the breath. It can be helpful to make mental notes of other things you notice happening in your mind, such as thought or memory or sound or an itch. So just make a mental note of the other experiences and then let them go, because they're impermanent, transitory. They come and they go, they're not always there. So if you just notice it, make a mental note of it, let it go, it will go. And then just keep coming back to the breath, your anchor to keep your awareness right here, right now. Also, the ideal state of mind that we have when meditating is one that is friendly, kind, patient towards ourselves, towards everything that arises in our experience. For some people that might be easy, for others it might be difficult. If we have the habit of being hard on ourselves, judging ourselves, being self-critical. So just be on the lookout for such attitudes. If you notice yourself being critical, judgmental towards yourself or towards anything that arises in your mind, any kind of thought or feeling or experience, just be aware of that and know that is not helpful. That is not something you want to perpetuate. So you could see that as another kind of distraction, another kind of disturbance. Notice it, label it, let it go. And try, if you can, to have a kind and gentle and non-judgmental, patient attitude towards yourself, towards your experiences. Okay, so you can now come out of the meditation, open your eyes, change your position if you need to. of you like to ask about a question? I can carry on talking. I have lots of things to say about meditation, but I also want to give you a chance to ask. Any question you might? Yes.
Sangye Khadro, thank you so much for coming to talk to us. And I will be, again, thank you for writing that wonderful book. I wondered, with the modern psyches being for mindfulness practice, mindfulness practice. Yeah. So we hear a lot sort of in the media, we're talking about mindfulness, this, that, and the other. I wondered, from your point of view, I mean, and we must accept that, you know, every group that practices meditation has a slightly different definition of what that is. From your point of view, what distinguishes meditative activity from mere mindfulness?
What was the first thing you said?
The difference between meditative activity
activity?
from meditation and mindfulness.
What's the difference between meditation and mindfulness? That's a little bit of a strange question because the term mindfulness is actually tricky because it has different meanings even within normal Buddhist teachings and practices. So in different contexts, they use the word mindfulness in slightly different ways. So it doesn't always have the same meaning. So, for example, in the first kind of meditation, I was talking about placement meditation or meditation for developing concentration, calm abiding. Mindfulness is one of the key elements of that kind of practice. But the way it's explained, it's not like mindfulness as in the popular secular method. Because mindfulness, the term mindfulness, is actually a mental factor in the Buddhist study of the mind. It's one factor of the mind. And the function of mindfulness, it's the same word as memory. You know, the real meaning of mindfulness is memory or remembering. So the mental factor, mindfulness, its function is to remember something and not forget it. And in the context of meditation, for example, the meditation that we just did on the breath, mindfulness is what enables us to remember that we're supposed to watch the breath and not wander off and think about the movie we saw last night or what we're going to do when you get home tonight or, you know, all these other things, zillions of other things that your mind could go to. So mindfulness is, so when we are able to stay on the breath and not forget it, not wander away from it, that means mindfulness is working, it's performing its function. So it means non-forgetfulness, not forgetting the object of your meditation. So that's one meaning of mindfulness. Another meaning of mindfulness, again, means sort of non-forgetfulness, just in our daily life. For example, if you want to not, if you want to be kind and avoid hurting people, that's something you consider important and valuable, okay? So that's something you sort of are trying to practice in your daily life. So mindfulness would be the ability to remember that and not forget it, okay? Not suddenly lose it and yell at somebody or say something hurtful or do something hurtful. So mindfulness enables us to remember, this is what I want to do, this is how I want to be. Does that make sense? So that's another meaning of mindfulness. But even in the Tibetan tradition, they also talk about mindfulness as it's explained more in the mindfulness-based stress reduction, which is just paying attention to what's happening moment by moment, just being aware of this moment and what's going on in this moment, especially in terms of your own mind. What is my mind doing right now? What's going on in my mind right now? So that is another way that the term mindfulness is used. So like I say, it's kind of a complex term that has multi-meanings. So with regard to your question, I'm not quite sure, having given that explanation. Could you say it again? And
yeah, it was really to hear your understanding, your explanation of mindfulness as being a part of our meditations. Because often I'm hearing people talk about mindfulness
meditation
as a
whole
meditation in itself,
Yeah.
and I always see it as an important factor and an essential part of the
Yeah.
meditation, but without an object to focus on.
Yeah.
We can be mindful that we're angry.
Yes. Yeah. So this popular mindfulness movement, it has kind of taken mindfulness, that term mindfulness, into another thing, like made it into a whole kind of meditation practice. But on the other hand, I mean, the Buddha did teach, for example, the Satipatthana Sutra. The sati is the Sanskrit term Pali term for mindfulness. So satipatthana means the foundation of mindfulness or the establishment of mindfulness. So in that sutra, the Buddha taught a method of practice, a method of meditation on 4 objects: the body, the feelings, pleasant, unpleasant, neutral, the mind, and phenomena, everything else. So, this is a practice that was taught by the Buddha, the 4 foundations. Sometimes it's called foundations of mindfulness or establishments of mindfulness. In Tibetan, it's called the 4 close placements of mindfulness, because it is existing in the Tibetan tradition as well. It's just not taught as popularly. So it is taught by the Buddha, that these 4 kinds of mindfulness on these 4 different objects, such as the body. So the people, for example, John Kabat-Zinn, who took the practice of mindfulness, I just think what he did is fantastic, because he brought this kind of practice to people who probably would walk into a Buddhist center, come to a Buddhist retreat, but needed it, because originally it was used for people suffering from pain. And what I've heard is pain medication, doesn't work for everybody. In fact, somebody told me it only works for about 30% of the people suffering from pain. So meaning 70% of people who have pain don't get help from medication. They need something else. And mindfulness can be very effective, very helpful for managing pain. So I think it's a fantastic idea, to take this method and teach it to people who are suffering from pain, stress, depression, eating disorders, and so on. And I don't know what the statistics are. I'm sure there are people who don't really get much help from it, but I think there are a lot of people who do get help. So I'm all for it. Buddha wanted to relieve suffering, and he taught all these methods for relieving suffering. So I think to get these methods out there to as many people as possible is wonderful, is fantastic. But it has kind of changed. Some traditional Buddhists are somewhat critical of the mindfulness movement because, for example, they say that they've taken just one part of Buddhism out of context and then taught it, made it very popular. And so now some people think that's all there is to Buddhism, just being mindful of what's happening each moment. That's Buddhism, and there's a lot more to Buddhism that isn't being taught. For example, ethics. One of the criticisms is that there's no mention of ethics, whereas the Buddha very much emphasized the importance of ethics, also as a foundation for meditation. I didn't mention that before, but I mentioned concentration and wisdom. But there's a third element that's very essential, and that is ethics. Those 3 things are the 3 main practices for attaining liberation from suffering, for attaining liberation and enlightenment. So ethics is a very important foundation for practice. If we don't know how to behave ourselves and be a nice person and stop being harmful and so on to others, then we're not going to be successful in our meditation, concentration, wisdom, and so on. So ethics is like a foundation. They say it's like the earth. Just like the earth is the foundation for all of life. We live on the earth. ethics is the foundation for spiritual practice. That's very, very, very important. So I think some changes are now happening because of all this discussion, and they are starting to bring more ethics into teachings on mindfulness, and also compassion. That's another very, very important aspect of Buddhist teachings, Buddhist practices. Loving kindness, compassion, just being really caring and so on to others. So I think that's also starting to come in more. So I don't know if I'm answering your question or not, but I'm kind of
you are entirely answering my question.
Yeah. But it is a tricky topic, because like I say, the term mindfulness does have so many meanings, so many, And I guess the only problem is if people get a very fixed idea, if they go to a mindfulness-based stress reduction course, and then they get this fixed idea, this is what mindfulness is, this is all it is, and it's nothing more than that. That might be problematic, because there is a lot more to mindfulness than what is being taught in these secular programs, and there's a lot more to Buddhism than just mindfulness.
Yes, but as you say, though, a lot of these techniques are taught to people that wouldn't walk into a Buddhist centre, so it's better to get that taste than not at all.
Yeah, not everybody's going to be a Buddhist. The Dalai Lama really emphasizes that. In fact, if you've heard him teach in the West or read teachings he's given in the West, he even says he doesn't encourage people to convert to Buddhism, to become Buddhist if you already have your own religion. He says it's better to stay with your own religion. Only if you really aren't satisfied with your own religion, or you don't have a religion, then you really want to become Buddhist, fine. But he says he really discourages that. So, but you can still take many of the Buddhist ideas and practices and utilize them, whether you're following another religion or no religion, whatever. So I think that's nothing wrong with that, and that's completely fine. So, like I say, I think it's wonderful that more and more people are learning and practicing mindfulness, and it's fine if they don't want to do anything else. They don't want to take on any other practices of Buddhism. That's fine, because if you do practice mindfulness sincerely, I think naturally you become a better person. You'll probably be healthier and happier and nicer and causing less trouble in the world. There's some interesting stories. I read a story about a policeman who learned mindfulness meditation. And after a while, he said, I don't want to be a policeman anymore, because I wouldn't want to kill anybody. So even though he wasn't sort of taught, that aspect of things, it just came to him naturally. Just becoming more mindful, he started to realize, I would not want to be in that position of having to shoot somebody. So he found another job. Yeah.
Oh, thank you so much.
Thank you. Yes?
Sorry, when you say that, the ideal is to practice shamatha and vipassana in one session, isn't it? When you say that one is not enough,
Yeah.
what you were doing now with our meditation was a little bit of shamatha, and then the vipassana element came in. When you say be compassionate with yourself, don't criticize yourself or something like that. So I would say it's advisable to do the two in one session, I suppose.
Well, ultimately, yes, ultimately. But the way it's taught, yeah, and I think in some traditions, for example, in Burma, they say you can practice both together, and also in Tantra, they say you can practice them together. But in other traditions, you practice them separately in the beginning, because when you're trying to develop shamatha, you really have to just focus on that. If you want to go all the way to the achievement of shamatha, you just have to focus on your object and not use thought, analysis, or anything. So when I talked about the importance of being kind to yourself, I didn't really mean that as, an analytical meditation, but just because so many people in the West, including myself, have this habit of not being kind to oneself. And if it isn't pointed out that that isn't healthy, then people might just continue and bring it into their meditation, So they're sitting there and they're being really hard on themselves and trying to have perfect concentration, and that's not going to work. So I was just trying to point out that when we practice meditation, our state of mind needs to be very kind and gentle and soft and friendly, rather than, whipping ourselves. So, but straightforward shamatha practice, if you're really focusing on that, you wouldn't be thinking about all these other things. You're just focusing. Initially, you might need to think sometimes, if your mind gets too crazy, carried away with distractions, you might need to think about something that would help you to calm down. So you do sometimes bring in some analysis just to get yourself back on track. But in later stages, you don't need to do that anymore. You just stay focused on your object. And then vipassana, which mainly means getting an understanding of emptiness, the true nature of things. That's the ultimate object for vipassana. So you develop that separately. And then they say you need to combine the two. You need to learn how to have single-pointed concentration on your understanding of emptiness. And they say it is a little hard because once you start to analyze, your mind gets shaky. It's no longer so calm. And then you have to go back to calm abiding and just, re-establish your stability. So they say you sort of have to go back and forth. But eventually you're able to have both. You'll have very firm, stable concentration, and at the same time do analysis. But I think that's quite a high level of practice. But yeah, ultimately, eventually, one does need to combine the two.
Sorry, before I pass the microphone, could you say a couple of words on I think what is the essence of Buddhist meditation in some way, which is the motivation and the dedication, because some people sometimes goes into into meditation immediately without. Yeah. But I see that it's very important here when Jesse Tashi teaches and things like that. They say, well, look, altruism as the motivation, then what you want as a dedication, because that gives all the ethical dimension you were talking about.
Yeah, I didn't talk about that here, and we didn't do that here, but normally Tibetan lamas, at least the ones that I've studied with, really emphasize the importance of meditating with a positive motivation. So at the beginning of a meditation session, you first calm yourself down, sit in a comfortable position, calm yourself down. Then you think about your motivation. Why am I here? Why am I doing this? But for beginners, they may not yet have a full sense of why they're meditating. So the lamas sort of encourage us to think, the purpose for doing meditation is to become enlightened, to help all living beings. But for beginners, that's like, wow, what do you mean, So it's good to take time to learn about what is enlightenment and how do I get enlightened and why do I get enlightened and how can I help sentient beings if I'm enlightened. So I think for many people it takes time to understand what that means before they're ready to really feel that way. Yes, that's what I want to do. So if you're not yet ready to think in that way, I want to become enlightened to help all living beings, then a simpler, more kind of down-to-earth motivation might be, I just want to help others. I want to be a good person. I want to help people and not harm people. I want to help the world. And if I do meditation, I'm hoping this will help me. to be a nicer person and be more kind to others. So something like that might be more accessible for people in the beginning. But yeah, they do say it's very, very important to have a positive motivation, a good motivation for doing meditation. Because sometimes it can happen that people are interested in meditation not for the right reasons. I met somebody once who he wanted to learn Buddhism and meditation and so on, and he told me he wanted to become a motivational speaker. And I had the feeling there's kind of a lot of ego there, you know. So I wasn't very comfortable with that. Seemed like he was interested in fame and, you know, maybe making money. So it's possible that people could have that kind of reason, that kind of motivation, which from the Buddhist point of view isn't the right one. That's not the right reason for learning meditation. We should at least have the wish to work on our mind, to bring about a positive transformation of our mind, to reduce our ego, our greed, our anger, our hatred, you know, try to make our mind better, more positive, and then try to help others more in a genuine way, and not be concerned about fame, money, power, those kinds of things. So try to have our motivation free of those. So, and then, yeah, at the end of this, at the end, when we finish meditation, they say we can dedicate the positive energy we created to others, to the world. May it bring about more peace and happiness and so on. Anyone else?
Thank you for a lovely talk. I went to hear Mathieu Ricard 2 weeks ago in London, and one of the things he said that was very striking was that he'd taken 25 years in a Himalayan cave to meditate in order to come out into the world for 20 years, to be effective and to be socially engaged. And he was much more he couldn't have been as effective as he was if he hadn't done 25 years in the Himalayan cave. So I'm just interested in your point of view about, with all your training and all your practice, has it been as long as 25 years before you were socially effective, or you were effective? Or how do you rate? I mean, is it possible? He also said 20 minutes a day for Westerners in a secular society can also bring about benefits. But then how long does that, how long do you need 20 minutes a day to practice for? So I'd just like your general views on the subject.
Well, I don't think there's a fixed way of doing it that should be followed by everybody. I mean, he's quite extraordinary. And Tenzin Palmo is another example, you know, a wonderful English nun. She spent, also, I can't remember how many years in a cave meditating. So there are people who have that kind of inclination and time, ability, you know, to be able to spend so much time working on themselves, working on their practice. In a solid chunk like that. I guess in my own case, even though I've always been very attracted to meditation, I've also discovered to my dismay that it's very difficult. I had this when I first started learning Buddhism. I had this sort of fantasy of being like Milarepa. You know, I just go into the mountains and sit in a cave and, you know, bliss out and become a Buddha. But then when I did my first meditation retreat, oh my God, I was so shocked to look at my mind and to see how crazy my mind was and how difficult meditation was. So I would not have been able to do what Mathieu Ricard or Tenzin Palmo did. So I try to do meditation and retreat. I try to do some every day, and I try to do retreat whenever I can. But in between that, I also find it very useful to study, to do study programs, and also teach. I mean, it wasn't my idea to become a teacher, but I was asked to teach, and I started doing it, and I found that really helpful as well, because when you have to teach people, you find out how much you really know and don't know, so it sort of encourages you to, work harder on your own understanding. And it's also a way of helping people, so it's, so I find that having those three kinds of activities, your own spiritual practice, increasing your knowledge by study, increasing your learning, and then being with people, working with people, trying to help people. So kind of going back and forth between those three is, for me personally, a good balance. So that's just another way, as opposed to being, in a cave for a long period of time. And then, of course, there are many people who, don't even have the chance to take off a chunk of time and do a retreat. If you're a mother, for example, or father, you have a job, or you have aged parents or other family members who you need to take care of, you can't just desert them and go and stay in a cave. So then the model or the suggestion of 20 minutes a day or even 10 minutes, Lama Yeshe used to say even 5 minutes a day of meditation is already something, better than nothing. So just trying to do a little bit of practice every day, and then in your daily life with the people you're taking care of, the people you're working and so on, just trying to be as ethical as you can, kind, compassionate, helpful. I mean, that's also a way of practicing. Meditation, sitting in formal meditation, isn't the only way to practice. Living your life with kindness and compassion is also a kind of practice. Although people might say, yeah, but I need to meditate to be able to do that, So I think it's good to have a balance of practice, sitting practice on your own, being with people to help them, to practice giving. That's practice too, giving, caring. And it also gives you a chance to see yourself, because you might fool yourself into thinking how patient you are, how kind you are, and then when you have to work with people and they push your buttons, then you find out, okay, no, I need more time on the cushion. So that's why it's good to kind of do both, to go back and forth. Plus study. I mean, not everyone is inclined to that, but the Dalai Lama, in recent years, he's been really emphasizing the importance of study. Probably also, one reason is because there's many Asian Buddhists who just have a lot of devotion, but not a whole lot of knowledge. They just believe, oh, Buddha is wonderful, fantastic, and the Dalai Lama is wonderful, fantastic. But if we ask them questions about, well, who is Buddha? What is the Dharma? It's hard for them to answer. So he says it's really important that we know. We have a good, he said we should be 21st century Buddhists. We should really know what the Buddha taught, what the Buddhist path is all about, not just have this sort of blind faith. So study is also important. Does that make sense? So then how much time you spend doing those three things, I think, would vary from one person to another, and also your own circumstances in life and so on.
Can you speak a little bit about visualization? Because I think your book, at the end, you have a section on visualization. Yeah. So.
Yeah. So this is a practice that's used a lot in Tibetan Buddhism. I think it's primarily from the Tantric or Vajrayana tradition. So Vajrayana is part of Mahayana Buddhism. I don't know how familiar you are with all the different Buddhist traditions, but there's two main traditions in Buddhism. One is called Mahayana, which means the great vehicle, and that's the kind of Buddhism Tibetan Buddhism belongs to, but also Zen in Japan, Chan in China, Pure Land. There's mostly in the northern Asian countries and Eastern Asian countries. The type of Buddhism they have is Mahayana. The other main type of Buddhism, I mean, sometimes it's called Hinayana, but a more contemporary term is Theravada Buddhism, and that's the kind of Buddhism you find in Southeast Asian countries like Burma, Thailand, Sri Lanka, Cambodia, and so on. So those are the two main traditions of Buddhism. And the main difference between them is that in the Mahayana tradition, what we aspire to is to become a Buddha. We want to follow in the footsteps of the Buddha and become like the Buddha and help all living beings. In the Theravada tradition, the main goal is liberating oneself from suffering, getting oneself out of this sea of suffering that we are in, but not helping everybody else become free of suffering as well. So it's a somewhat different emphasis there. So anyway, Mahayana Buddhism, the kind of Buddhism Tibetan Buddhism belongs to, has again two divisions. And one of those divisions is called Tantra or Vajrayana Buddhism, and became very widespread in Tibet. It's also found in Japan. There's some temples in Japan that also do this kind of practice. So that's where the practice of visualization mainly comes from. And there's lots of different, we don't have too many examples here, but in many Tibetan temples and monasteries and so on, the walls are covered with images of different Buddha figures, many, many, many different Buddhas. And so there are practices in which one would visualize these Buddha images, sometimes only one, sometimes many, and also visualizing oneself as a Buddha if one has received the right instructions. So that's one way of using visualization. And the reason it's done in that kind of practice is to speed up one's development towards enlightenment, because it said that we have the potential to be enlightened, but we sometimes don't think we have that potential. We sometimes feel, I can't do it, I'm hopeless, I'm so far away from enlightenment. So we sort of limit ourselves. So in that kind of practice, imagining oneself as already a Buddha, already enlightened, and how one would think, how one would relate to others and the world and so on. So it's like imagining you're already enlightened. I mean, you have to do it in the right way. You have to, do it with the right understanding and the right motivation and so on. But if you do that practice in the right way, it's said to help you reach enlightenment more quickly. So that's the reason or purpose for doing that kind of practice. But there's other ways of using visualization. For example, in our analytical meditations, one way or one kind of analytical meditation is to develop compassion, loving kindness, these positive states of mind towards others. So while doing those kind of practices, if you actually visualize other people, other beings who are suffering, it makes the practice much more powerful rather than just thinking in an abstract way. So if you really think about suffering beings, suffering people, suffering animals, and so forth, it really enhances the power of your meditation on compassion. So there's different ways you can use visualization. Is that what you're asking about? Or?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. So Tonglen will be part of this practice, exactly.
Yeah. So when doing Tonglen, also you use visualization. For example, you think of a person. I mean, you can do Tonglen, for example, with a person. If you're visiting somebody in the hospital and they're actually there, lying there in front of you, and they're in pain or they're dying. Yeah, so then the Tonglen practice, you think of their suffering and you imagine taking the suffering away from them in the form of smoke or fog or something, taking it into yourself and then sending them all your positive energy and so on. So you can do it with a real person present in front of you, but you can also do it just imagining the person. If your mother is somewhere else, you can think of her, wherever she is, and imagine taking her suffering away. So yeah, visualization is also used in that kind of practice.
And so, last question. Within Mahayana, you mentioned Tantra, 2 schools, and the other one, what is the name?
The other one is called, there's 2 terms. One is Sutrayana, Sutrayana or Paramitayana. So those 2 terms are interchangeable. So that means Mahayana practice, which does not include the Tantra or Vajrayana practice. So for example, Chinese Buddhism mostly would be Sutrayana. It's Mahayana, but Sutrayana, Paramitayana, not Vajrayana.
Okay, thank you.
Buddhism is very complex. So many different traditions and schools and methods and so on.
Thanks. In relation to the topic of suffering, I work as a therapist, and very recently I've been working with somebody who is really struggling with the concept of tolerating and enduring the suffering of others. So
Tolerating what?
Suffering of others.
Yeah.
So she seems to be very focused on 2 news stories that have been in the UK recently where children died and they would have suffered during their death. And she has been very, very distressed over a period of time, weeks, constantly Googling information about what happened and the process she's going through, and she's trying to find information that means they didn't suffer. That's the key for her, that they didn't suffer. The reality is they probably did. And she can't endure or tolerate the knowledge of that suffering. And I'm trying to find ways to help her, but it's difficult because she feels anything I suggest is a bit of a sticking plaster for her. I just wondered whether, A, what your thoughts on that might be, but also whether Buddhism would have anything to say about that.
Sounds rather complex.
Yeah.
Like Buddhism.
Sorry?
I said it's complex like Buddhism.
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, it's just what pops up in my mind. It sounds like she has some personal issue about suffering. And the story of the children is triggering this off her, triggering this in her. So, yeah, it just sounds like maybe she needs to get in touch with her own issue about suffering. I mean, Buddhism, it is a difficult thing, suffering. Buddha, like I say, the very first thing he talked about after becoming enlightened was suffering. And it's like he really wants people to accept, acknowledge the reality, the existence of suffering. Suffering is there. Suffering exists. And yet, many people, I mean, I think for many of us, our way of dealing with suffering isn't very healthy. I think we kind of fall into 2 extremes. One is denial. I don't want to know, I don't want to see, I don't want to experience. We try to avoid it. And the other is the other extreme, the opposite, just getting overwhelmed by it and feeling, depressed and miserable and despair, as if it's never ending, as if it's all there is and it's going to go on forever. So that's another kind of extreme. So it sounds maybe like she's in that second one, that she's just overwhelmed by it and doesn't know how to deal with it in a sort of healthy way. And I think within Buddhism there are some ideas, some contemplations that could be helpful. One is impermanence. Buddha talked a lot about impermanence, and it simply means, I mean, it's just a fact, a reality of things. Everything is changing all the time. Our body is changing every moment, our mind is changing every moment, everything in the world around us is changing every moment. And that, it's very helpful to apply that idea to suffering. Suffering does exist, yes, but it's not permanent. So understanding, realizing, being aware of the impermanent nature of suffering is enormously helpful. And this is part of the practice of mindfulness. When you're practicing mindfulness, you're watching what is happening moment by moment by moment by moment. You see things are coming and going. Just for example, I used it once on a headache that I had. I'd had this headache for several days, and I tried taking paracetamol, and it just wouldn't go away. And one night I was trying to go to sleep, but I couldn't get to sleep because of this headache. So I just used mindfulness. I just focused on what was going on in my head, this so-called headache, and just observed what was going on. And I could see, it was kind of really fascinating how there were actually, it wasn't this solid block of pain, which it might appear to be initially, but when you really focus on it and watch it, you can see it's actually changing, it's moving, it's coming and going, and different kinds of sensations. And when you see that, it's like, it was really fascinating. And it also made it go away. It just sort of dissipated. So, we tend to have this fear of looking at suffering, facing it, confronting it, as if I'll suffer more if I do that. But the opposite actually happens. And this is very much part of the mindfulness practice, at least the way, I don't know, secular mindfulness, but in the way it's taught in the Theravada countries, Burma, Thailand, and so on. Even if you have pain, if you have mental suffering, physical suffering forever, you don't run away from it. You sit with it, you watch it, you observe it. And it's initially, a little bit frightening, and you want to run away. But if you just sit with it and watch it, this is what you discover. It's not so permanent and solid as it appears to be. It's changing and moving. And then it might just go away. Sometimes it does, which is quite an amazing discovery. But even if it doesn't go away, you just see it as much more fluid and flexible and transparent than it appeared before. So I don't know if this would be appropriate for this person, but it just the feeling that I get, it sounds to me like she needs to face suffering, but see that it's not so permanent and fixed and solid. Also, just to realize that everybody has suffering. Everyone has suffering. Nobody is free with it. Everyone has their own unique individual suffering, but everybody does have suffering. And that's also helpful for various reasons. One is to realize I'm not the only one who has suffering. Because if we think like that, this is what happens when we have a problem. If it's physical pain or mental pain or whatever, we tend to get kind of obsessed with it. And it almost seems as if I'm the only one in the world who has suffering, or my suffering is the worst suffering in the world. Nobody's suffering is as bad as mine. So it, in a sense, can appear really, really huge, which probably isn't the case. So it's very helpful to realize other people have suffering too, and probably some people have worse suffering than you do, than oneself. When you realize that, your own suffering can seem to shrink. It seems smaller, more manageable. And it also helps you to not feel so alone. You feel more connected with others. And it also helps you to have more compassion, more openness, more concern for others. So these are some different ideas within Buddhism that I think are really, really helpful to balance our awareness of suffering so that it doesn't become an obsession and it doesn't become like something huge and unbearable and unmanageable. So I don't know if this is helpful or not, but Yeah, this sounds like she needs to deal with suffering in a more realistic way. Maybe she has some unrealistic ideas about suffering.
Thank you.
I want to mention, yeah? Mother.
In response to your sharing there, there were some pictures. There's a phase at the moment of people who are hungry having to engage in cannibalism, and there was pictures of this situation, and I found it immeasurably unbearable for a very long time. Because of the suffering of the people who were about to be eaten and the suffering of the people who were having to eat. And one man, he went into the police station and he begged the police to arrest him so that he didn't have to eat another human being. And so then I wanted to weep, and then I got very angry, and I got very angry with the whole world, because there's so much food in the world that it was ridiculous that anyone should have to be living in this situation. And then I realized that my compassion actually probably was more an empathic pain, that I was feeling the pain of all these other people. And so the only way I've been able to deal with this is to go more deeply into the essence of the compassion, and what is it that makes the Buddha of compassion compassionate, and what is compassion. And in that journey, it's alleviated some of my suffering, because it's given me a distraction to focus on something else, because there isn't a bean that I can do about the starvation of fellow human beings on this planet. And although the tears will come for all those people and for all the rest of us who are having to bear witness of this atrocity in this world of plenty, I sometimes wonder if the Buddhas, when you go more deeply into the meditations, you actually are able to transcend the lower realms of samsara and move into higher realms. But then I feel guilty, because I think perhaps I'm running away from the suffering of these lower realms where people are rendered to eat each other. And although this probably isn't a question, but I wonder if you could perhaps talk a little bit more on how we, as budding practitioners of Buddhism, entering into the ideology of compassion, can find the balance of true compassion and living with compassion in a world which is so lacking in compassion. Because I feel there's a duality. And that becomes quite painful, because it's an unresolvable conflict.
Well, one thing comes to mind, this story that I heard that was really helpful for me. Somebody asked a question to this Lama. He's the head of one of the schools of Tibetan Buddhism, Sakya Trizin, great master. So somebody asked him the question, how is it possible for a bodhisattva? A bodhisattva is a person who is trying to reach enlightenment. So they're on the Mahayana path. Their goal is becoming enlightened to help all living beings. And compassion is one of their main practices. So they really do a lot of meditation on compassion. They really think about all the suffering of all the beings and, open up to that. So the question was, how does a bodhisattva open up to and be aware of all of the suffering of living beings and not become completely depressed about it? And the answer given by this Lama, he said, he used an analogy. He said, it's like if you have a friend who's sleeping, lying there on the couch, asleep, and they have a nightmare. And you can tell they're having a nightmare because they're sort of rolling around and crying out and, obviously experiencing some fear. And whatever they're experiencing is only in their mind. It's just a dream, a bad dream. So you can see that they're suffering, but you don't suffer with them because you know that it's only in their mind. And your job is to wake them up and assure them it's only a dream, it's not real. So he said in a similar way, bodhisattva, because a bodhisattva, on the path, you develop compassion and many other qualities, but you also develop wisdom, the wisdom that understands the true nature of things, emptiness. I don't know if you've had any teachings on emptiness, but this is like, an essential aspect of the path. So with the understanding of emptiness, it's not easy to understand, but you come to understand all the things we normally see and experience and so forth are somewhat illusory, like an illusion, like a dream, not as real and solid and fixed and permanent as they appear to be. So this isn't a cop-out. It isn't just saying, it's all an illusion. But you really understand that. You have to go through quite a process of thinking about how things exist and how we see things and do they really exist the way they see them and so on. So when you come to have an understanding of emptiness, a proper, genuine understanding of emptiness, they say you see things, but you know they're not as solid and real as they appear to be, and they're more like dreams, more like illusions. Okay? So bodhisattva would be meditating on that, developing that understanding. So when a bodhisattva sees the world and all the suffering in the world, of course they're moved, touched, motivated to relieve the suffering, but they know it's not as solid and real and permanent as it appears to be. It's more illusory, illusion-like, dream-like. So the answer was, this is how a bodhisattva is able to see the suffering, be aware of the suffering, and not be depressed about it or in despair about it. So I think it's a tricky balance, to have compassion, to realize there are sentient beings and they are suffering. For them, the suffering is real. But at the same time, the bodhisattva knows it's not as real as it appears to be. So for me, that answer was really helpful. Not that I understand emptiness, but sometimes you get little glimmers of it. And like I say, it doesn't mean that you then use whatever idea you have about emptiness to just turn your back on the world and think, it's not real. It's just an illusion. So I'm just going to go and sit in my cave and meditate. So that wouldn't be right. But you also don't get overwhelmed by the awareness of suffering because it's not quite as solid as it appears to be. I don't know, does that make any sense?
Most greatly.
Yeah.
I'm really grateful because it's an aspect which I had forgotten, the illusory world, the illusory body. I had forgotten that, and that's really helpful if it's something perhaps for me to work with more in my meditation.
And also I look at the Dalai Lama and the huge responsibility that he has for his people, for the Tibetan people, and the terrible tragedy that has happened. It's been like kind of like a Holocaust, for the last 60 years or almost, 70 years now. I don't know. Anyway, a long time and an enormous amount of tragedies and suffering and so on. And yet, I know he's fully aware, fully in touch, fully, compassionate. But at the same time, he's joyful and positive and optimistic, and he doesn't let it get him down. And I've heard him say sometimes that when, say, a Tibetan refugee has just come out of Tibet and they come to see him and they tell all these stories and, the torture, the loss of life and so on. So they're crying and he says, he cries too. He cries with them. He says, but it's more like on the surface. It's on the surface of his mind. And deeper down, it's calm. His mind is calm. And he doesn't, continue crying very, very long. He, quickly gets beyond it. So he has this strong resilience to be able to know the suffering, be aware of the suffering, but not be overwhelmed by it, not drowned in it. So for me, that's a good, an example of how to be aware of suffering, but at the same time be on top of it and still keep your cool, your wisdom and your balance. Because if you get overwhelmed by somebody else's suffering, your ability to help them will be diminished, right? It's like if you have a child. If a child is crying, upset, miserable, and they come to you, and if you become also crying and upset and miserable, are you able to help that child very much? Don't you need to keep your mind sort of strong and stable and balanced? You want to understand the child, have compassion for the child, but you also want to help the child to get beyond the state that they're in. So I think for me that's the ideal of a bodhisattva, to be aware of and in touch with the suffering, but still on top of it, rather than drowning in it. But it's easier said than done, of course. I think it takes quite a lot of meditation and study and practice and experience to be able to do that. But I do feel it's possible, especially looking at the examples of people like His Holiness and these other wonderful lamas.
Thank you.
Is that helpful?
Very much so, really very much so. Thank you.
One more question?
Hello. It's not really a question, but also I've been able to use compassion, but in a good way. Is that instead of being overwhelmed by the suffering and feeling the suffering of others too much, be able to understand it, acknowledge it, put them in a bubble of love, and let them have their suffering. Understand it, but put it a bit far and send them some love, so that you are still able to stand and help them. So that's how it helped me.
Yeah, because sometimes, I know just the thought that comes to mind by what you're saying is maybe we sometimes are projecting on other people. Yeah. Like we see somebody who's suffering and it's like, oh, that's terrible, that's terrible. And maybe that person isn't suffering as much as we imagine them to be. Yeah. Maybe they're actually, okay, there is some suffering there, but maybe we are exaggerating and projecting and, and also it makes us feel so uncomfortable, to have to look at it. So those kind of reactions, I think, are not real compassion. Real compassion is being willing to go into the other person's reality and understand what's really going on with them. And also, I don't know if this is what you meant, but sometimes there's this feeling of wanting to fix them, like I want to fix this person, I want to fix this situation because it's so unpleasant, it's so uncomfortable for me. Yeah. And that might be also making us a little bit frantic. And we may not be able to. Yeah. So sometimes we have to be willing to just sit with it. And maybe it's not fixable. It's not possible to just, get rid of it, but it will take a while. I don't know if what I'm saying makes sense, but just recently, for example, I saw this cat, and I noticed the cat had one eye missing. There's a hole there instead of an eye, and sort of dried blood around it. I was just like, horrified, oh, poor cat. But actually, when I looked more, the cat looked kind of normal, like okay. So maybe, yeah, initially it was painful to lose the eye, but maybe the cat adjusted to it and was okay and was managing even without this eye. So my initial horror and shock, was my stuff. I was kind of projecting my stuff onto that. So this is something to notice, to just try to be aware of, that our reaction, we might be overreacting and over exaggerating the actual situation. There's so many things to learn about suffering and about compassion and about wisdom and so on. Yeah, and Buddhism says it's very important to balance wisdom and compassion, those two. Maybe this is a good thing to end with tonight. They say that just as a bird needs two wings to fly, you cannot fly with only one wing, a bodhisattva, somebody who's aspiring to reach enlightenment, needs compassion and wisdom. They're like two wings that enable the bodhisattva to ascend to enlightenment. So if one of those is there but the other one is missing, then it's incomplete. And they do balance each other out. The wisdom balances the compassion. Without wisdom, compassion can be maybe over-emotional. But compassion also balances wisdom. Without compassion, wisdom can be sort of dry and intellectual and sterile. So it's important to have both in a balanced way. So, yeah, before we finish, I just wanted to mention another book that I would like to recommend. It's also called How to Meditate, but it's written by Pema Chodron. And it's a relatively recent book, just in the last couple of years. And I love the subtitle, A Practical Guide to Making Friends with Your Mind. So check, are you friends with your mind? And if not, it's also a nice book because it's relatively simple. Like my book has a lot of meditation, a lot of different kinds, analytical visualization and so on, whereas hers is mainly meditation on the breath, but brings in a lot of other things like how to deal with thoughts, how to deal with emotions, a big section on how to deal with emotions, which I think many people can benefit from, because when you try to meditate, our meditation can be invaded by all kinds of emotions coming up. So it's useful to know how to deal with those. So let's take a few moments to make a dedication of the positive energy we've created here tonight. Coming together, wanting to know about meditation, listening, thinking, doing some meditation, discussing these different topics. So this has been a good thing to do. Try to feel positive, feel good about having come here and spent this time. We've created some good energy. Hopefully we all learned something and felt inspired to do more practice, more meditation. So this has been a good use of our time. We've created some good energy. And now we can share that energy with others. By this positive energy we've created, may all people and all beings everywhere become free of their suffering as quickly as possible, and also the causes of suffering like ignorance, hatred, greed, and so on. May they, as quickly as possible, achieve genuine peace and happiness, and the causes of happiness, love, compassion, wisdom, contentment. And may they, as quickly as possible, develop their potential for enlightenment and reach that wonderful state of peace. Okay, so thank you for coming. And I wish you good luck in your practice.